I think it was a feature of Israel's communal worship that some of those psalms were very much done in that sort of speaker and response from the congregation. And Psalm 136, which we'll briefly touch on later, it's just continuously repeating that phrase, the steadfast love of the Lord endures forever, which I think you probably all picked up by the end of it. And that's the key word that we're going to find in the book of Ruth, this Hebrew word hesed, which means steadfast love, enduring love, loyal love. So we will come to that. All right, so tonight we're going to go through the background, some of the key themes in the book of Ruth. The book of Ruth is a really well-known narrative, but it's, of course, tucked historically in the time of the Judges at some point between there and the arrival of David, establishment of the monarchy. And though it's a short book, it's packed with a lot of meaning. It's a story about faithfulness. It's a story about redemption. It's a story about God's hand working in an unseen way. But before we dive into each chapter, we want to step back and look at the background, some of the key themes, main characters that make the story compelling. Most of us know the story of Ruth, and that can be, that's obviously a great blessing. But there's two dangers with knowing something so well. One is what's sometimes called the lullaby effect. We've heard it so often and so many times that it ceases to have its meaning. It ceases to have some of the power. And the other challenge is sometimes we've heard it so many times and expounded so many times that it begins to sort of build up like a whole collection of standard interpretations, which might reflect more of our preference than what perhaps is actually happening in the record. So over-familiarity and perhaps a history of over-interpreting are two things we need to be aware of. So hopefully we'll have a bit of a fresh look as we go through. What's the book about? Absolute, super simple, boil it down. Well, you've got a family that's extinguished in Moab and left destitute, and your conclusion is the establishment of the royal line of David. You go from emptiness in Moab to the promise of a king in Bethlehem. And the connective thread that enables all of that is the most unlikely person you could find in the biblical narrative, with possibly the exception of Rahab, and that's a Moabite widow, right? A nation that was accursed by God. A Moabite widow, but it's her faith that carries forward the kingdom of God. And the story gives us two key ideas. The first one, generally, that I'll take out of the book of Ruth, is that God's plan is implemented in the little details. It's the little things of our faith, of our lives, which really is us partnering with God to bring forward his agenda, right? And that certainly is what happened with Ruth. God's purpose was powered by her loyal love, by her faith, and that ultimately leads to bringing forward David. The second idea is really just the way that God works in our lives. Right? It's not these big flashy things that happen, even though sometimes we might attribute those to the hand of God. God is working in the small details. Which field we just happen to stop by to work in that day, right? And we don't necessarily see the result of God's hand in our lives. We like to think that we do, and maybe sometimes we do. But did Ruth see the ultimate fruit of her faithfulness? No. I mean, sure, she was blessed with a marriage and with a child, but the book of Ruth makes clear that the ultimate of all of it was actually David. And that didn't happen until generations later. And really, the result of Ruth's faithfulness was 1,000 some years later when Jesus was born. And still going on. So sometimes, yes, God is working and acting in our lives, but it might be the things that bring final fruit in the kingdom, in his purpose, not necessarily things we see in our lives. Not necessarily. Sometimes we may. All right, just, I guess, a little bit about the book itself. It's not a very long book. You probably figured that. In Hebrew, there's 1,252 Hebrew words. There'll be a test on that later. 1,252, lock it in. It's a very short book. It's really well preserved. There's no real issues, textual questions, minor detail in chapter 2, but it's of no real import. The strange thing is, we all know that Ruth sits between Judges and 1st of Samuel, and that's kind of where it sits historically. But it seems that the earliest, and there's different versions up there on the screen, you can see Septuagint, Babylonian Talmud, and then a couple of the Proto-Masoretic texts. They actually put Ruth in the wisdom literature, not in the historical books. You go, okay, cool. Why? I mean, there's no doubt the book is located historically in the period of the Judges generally, but why would you put it with the wisdom books? And I think it's because the rabbis saw in the book of Ruth something more than mere history. They saw it as a wisdom book, something that could teach you how to live. And historically, it was traditionally read by the Jews at the Feast of Pentecost, right, or Feast of Weeks, which is 50 days after Passover and was aligned with when traditionally the law was given in Exodus chapter 19, which was a pretty common custom to align those two things. And part of the rationale was given for reading Ruth at the Feast of Weeks was that Ruth embodied the spirit of the law. That if you were actually going to live the Torah, if you were actually going to reflect that, it would be done in a way that Ruth and Boaz, but particularly that Ruth demonstrated. Because that loving faithfulness, that is a key theme in the book of Ruth, embodied the spirit of the law. I think there's something in that. Okay, so when was the book of Ruth written? I mean, it's clear that it's written a long time after. Oh, you know what? I have not done that. Cool. Now you know what I was talking about. Thanks for the pointer, Sarah. And let's go with that. All right. It is clear that Ruth was written a long time after the events that are described, and there's a couple of really clear clues. Ruth chapter 4, we learn that Ruth was the great-grandmother of David, which means, because the end of chapter 4 is a key integral part of the text, it's not a late addition, according to people who can read the Hebrew better than I'll ever do, that's when the story was written. So clearly it's not written until, at least David is known to be someone of significance. Ruth chapter 1 verse 1, in the days of the judging of the judges is the Hebrew. It's a really awkward framing of words, and it seems like it's someone who was perhaps not as familiar with the judges period, that it was long past. And in Ruth chapter 4 verse 7, in the sort of final scene where Ruth, wins the man, Boaz wins the court case, and it's all right. There's explanation of this whole ceremony of taking off the sandal and swapping shoes and stuff. Now, you only need to explain those details if the readers don't live in a world where that's still happening, right? So time has passed before the book of Ruth is actually written. Now, a very early theory, according to the Talmud, was that Samuel wrote the book, and that's a very traditional view, but that doesn't really explain those time markers incredibly well, and particularly David rising to prominence, because Samuel had pretty much fallen off out of the scene at that point. So it doesn't really mesh too well with some of those markers. Some people suggest that it was a post-exilic scribe, so it was written really late. Now, one of the reasons for that is when they read through the text, there's several instances of modern words. So if you were reading Shakespeare and suddenly he mentioned the internet in Macbeth, you would laugh and then be a little confused and then think, someone's done something, maybe I shouldn't have asked ChatGPT to give me the words to Macbeth, right? Something's been inserted in here. So there's about 8 instances where that has happened in the text of Ruth. So some scholars say it's late. Other scholars say yes, but there's early words and early grammar. So there's this thing, which is really exciting, I know, called Standard Biblical Hebrew. That's the early stuff. And then Late Biblical Hebrew, which is the later stuff. And just like we read the King James, we immediately know it's old school. Same sort of thing. The grammar's different, the words are different. There's the Hebrew equivalent of these and thous or something some such a type of thing with. Anyway, it is most likely, I think, that, well, it could be that it was written late and people put in old-style language, or just as possible, it was written early and some people have updated it along the way. It's a bit, scholars will argue each way. What about this final suggestion that possibly it was written by a woman? You'll find that in a number of scholars. Now, there's no evidence for that per se, can't prove it, and it's fundamentally unlikely in the very patriarchal world that most of the Bible books came from. However, it's a really unusual book. All right? What other book of the Bible gives us female perspective? If you screw your face up and say, oh, none really, you got the answer right. Esther perhaps features a leading female character, but it's her uncle who actually is like the voice of reason and wisdom, who tells her what to do at critical times. And it's more, she's there, but she's not a driver. In the book of Ruth, quite uniquely, we have women who are taking the initiative. It's women who are talking to each other and expressing their thoughts. We don't actually get that in any other book of the Bible. Right? It's quite different, quite unique. And we see that female perspective, for example, in how they talk about marriage. Right? So if you look in Ruth 1 verse 9, may the Lord enable you to find security in the house of a new husband. Ruth 3, my daughter, I must find a home for you so you will be secure. Ruth 4 verse 15, he, the child, will take care and provide for you when you are old. Like, the women are seeing marriage as a means of finding economic security and certainty. The men in Ruth and elsewhere, when they talk about marriage, it's about a child to carry on your name. Right? A very different perspective. We don't sort of see that anywhere in Ruth, anywhere apart from in Ruth, and we certainly don't see how women were thinking, feeling, relating to each other like we do. So, yes, absolutely interesting idea. Possible, unlikely, and there isn't actually any evidence for it. But it is something that's floated in there, and I think it's interesting to think about and acknowledge that this book does have a different perspective. And the irony of a guy standing up to give a Bible class on Ruth and pointing that out is not lost on me. But that's what it is. All right, so what's some of the broader context? One of the things I love about Scripture is some of the bigger narratives that shape the text and I think can inform our reading. And there's a few things with the book of Ruth which certainly do that. Regardless of where it's placed in the scrolls, the order, the historical context is pretty clear, and it's the book of Judges. Now, think about the end of the book of Judges. 4 times you have the expression, there was no king in Israel, everyone did what is right in his own eyes. And that's really just in those last few chapters. How do those last couple of chapters roll? Well, here's the basic headlines of each of those chapters. Chapter 17, you have Micah. This fella comes from the Ephraimite hill country, so he's Ephraim. Steals money from his mum. His mum, complains. He gives it back. She gives him 1,000 talents of silver. He makes an idol. Great. Makes a shrine and compels a Levite who's left Bethlehem to become his priest. Okay, cool. Verse 18, the Danites can't defeat the locals, can't take their inheritance, so they head north. Along the way, they steal the idol. They then slaughter the innocent northerners, set up the northern shrine. Now, it says specifically in Judges 18 that shrine continues unto this day. It's probably the site that Jeroboam, son of Nebat, the king who rebelled against Rehoboam, Solomon's son, set up as one of the key sites to stand in opposition to Jerusalem. But it had been going all the way from Joshua 18 rather. Judges 18, sorry. Chapter 19, the men of Gibeah in Benjamin gang rape a concubine from Bethlehem to death. So the men of Gibeah gang rape a concubine from Bethlehem. Sorry, I'm stumbling over my words a bit there. And then in Judges 20 to 21, you've got Benjamin refusing to do the right thing and hand over the guilty. You've then got a civil war where you have the high priest and the tribe of Judah leading the fight against Benjamin. An absolute disaster. Pretty horrific time. And you could well think, as you read through that history, well, is there no goodness? Is there no righteousness? Is there no one who's faithful in this entire place? It's an abominable list of, activities through chapter 17 through to chapter 21 of Judges. And then you have the book of Ruth. And the book of Ruth has the complete opposite on display, right? You have a faithful, mighty man in Bethlehem, Boaz. That's how he's described in Ruth chapter 2. It's the mighty man from Bethlehem who's going to save your inheritance. And I haven't done that. It's so annoying. Thank you for the nod, Sarah. You've got a mighty man from Bethlehem. He's going to give you your inheritance, save your inheritance, as he does for Naomi. He's going to act, even when not compelled to care for the widows and the helpless and the foreigners. And finally, the book of Ruth shows that faithfulness is the bedrock of the Davidic kings. Now, I find it difficult to imagine that those two things are not being specifically contrasted. Sorry, now it's up there on the screen. The record of the last 4 chapters of Judges and what we see in Ruth are a clear contrast. I don't think that's particularly accidental. And I think it provides a real clue, maybe not a conclusion, but a real clue about the time of the writing of Ruth. If it was early, it's a pretty clear link to David, and it also establishes the credentials of his lineage, faithful woman, Boaz the righteous man of Bethlehem, and also fit within David's reign, or perhaps in Solomon Rehoboam's reign, but early on, when there's a lot of opposition from Ephraim, which is Judges 17, the false shrine in Dan up north, which is Judges 18, and the Benjamites, who were the key source of opposition through Saul and his descendants to David. So it probably, I think, argues very much against Saul's lineage and presents a vision of what a faithful Israel led by a faithful man from Bethlehem could and should look like, what it could be, what Israel could be if it lived with loving kindness and faithfulness. So I think that an early composition is the most likely, and I do think there is that comparison being drawn between the Judges, Ephraim, Benjamin, and the Danite shrine with the Davidic king that arises from faithfulness in Bethlehem. So I shall try and remember to do that. I think Ruth is also operating at another level to bring together another couple of disturbing stories that link the ancestry of the main players. Again, it's a meta-narrative that's going on. In Genesis 19, you have the origins of Moab, right? We know the story. Lot has to flee with his daughters, lose absolutely everything. And the girls, because they have no hope of a family, make their father drunk, sleep with him to preserve the family name, and Moab is the result of that incest. It's an extremely distasteful story. And Moab then becomes an enemy of Israel, and if you're a Moabite, you're banned from joining Israel for 10 generations. Deuteronomy 23, verse 3. So distasteful, it's fundamentally a reason why Israel and Moab had a terrible relationship. But then there's another relative, another story, another skeleton in the closet, and that's in the family of Judah. In Genesis 38, you've got the story of Tamar. So she essentially is widowed and childless, and her father-in-law is holds back his younger son from marrying her, denies her right to have a child. Obviously, this is all coming in a very patriarchal society. And Tamar has to trick Judah, ancestor of Moab, into giving her a child, into sleeping with her. And it really appears that she is relying on a precursor to some of the Levirate laws of marriage that we find in Deuteronomy chapter 25, which already predated the law of Moses. We find them in Assyrian and Hittite culture as well. So So you've got these two stories that now are being brought together in the book of Ruth. Ruth herself, a Moabite, descendant of Lot, she's lost everything. And through time, she eventually gets there, but this child of Moab is going to unite with a descendant of Tamar, expand the Old Testament law, something which comes out in chapter 3. They don't actually apply the law of the Redeemer. They don't apply the law of the Levirate marriage. Naomi and Ruth expand the law dramatically and completely ignore the prohibition about Moabites not entering into the congregation. So, this time, despite there being that odd sort of midnight visit to the threshing floor in Ruth 3, this time these two families come together and honour is preserved because faithfulness is what is motivating all the characters in the story. And combined, they're going to prepare the way for King David and advance the kingdom plans. The reality is, as Scripture demonstrates many times, our history and our past and our family connections don't define us. It's how we operate in the here and now rather than what our ancestors did that actually matters in God's plan and drives our relationship with him. Okay, so what of the... There we go, it's working. So what of the main characters? Well, the book of Ruth, if we're being honest, has probably been misnamed. It should really be called the Book of Naomi. Because if you think about the book, the start of the book is the tragedy of Naomi. The end of the book is the redemption of Naomi. And all the way through, it's about how things are happening and changing in Naomi's life. True, Ruth is the key driver, clearly gets the Oscar for Best Supporting Actress ever, but the story is actually about Naomi and her tragedy and her redemption and blessings. Ruth is the means, but everyone in the story is identified by how they are related to or interact with Naomi. That's the key thing. And one of the things that has been pointed out, which I sort of thought was interesting, is that Naomi really is the female Job. Right? If you think about Job, he had all of his possessions stripped away from him, which happens at the start with the famine, and then all of his family, effectively, apart from his wife, is stripped away from him. And the same thing happens to Naomi, except arguably it goes further with Naomi because she loses her husband and she's also left as a female, which means she's far more vulnerable than Job was. And she didn't even have his 3 useless friends around her. But yes, we don't know a great deal about Naomi. She clearly believed that God was responsible for her trouble, but we also see her seizing the initiative, arguably 3 times, I would suggest. Naomi drives the story forward. In Ruth chapter 1, verse 4, after Elimelech dies, we read that the 2 boys were married. Now, we're not told this explicitly, but in the times, marriages were usually arranged by the parents, so Naomi possibly was involved in driving that. In Ruth chapter 1, verse 6, she makes the decision to return to Bethlehem, and it's she who initiates the plan for Ruth to go by night to see Boaz in Ruth chapter 3, verse 1. What did Naomi believe? Well, we don't really know. You can read in Ruth chapter 1 where she tries to send Orpah and Ruth back, and she tells Ruth, go back 4 separate times and explains why, right? We might think, well, that's a little bit strange. Why would you push people towards Moab rather than take them with you to Bethlehem? It seems kind of not really what we would expect, certainly from a Christian evangelical perspective. And more than that, she's publicly bitter against God. When she gets back to Bethlehem, she's happy to tell everybody the terrible things that God has done to her. She sees him as an adversary. But flip side of that, Naomi lived in the time of the Judges. It was a difficult, dangerous time. And the reality is, all of us are saved by grace, not by perfect theological consistency at every point in our life, especially when we're going through what Naomi went through. So despite her initial despair, Naomi is a character that clearly goes through, renewal in her faith, and she demonstrates a lot of selfless love. Even when she attempts to send her daughters back, she's really putting their interests ahead of hers. It's the first act of sacrificial love in the book, is putting their interests ahead of hers straight away. Immediately reduced her own prospects of support. And obviously she initiates the approach to Boaz, which really was working more for Ruth's benefit than it was for Naomi's. So again, there's that element of sacrificial love in what she does. What about Boaz? Well, he comes across as the template Israelite. He's obviously a wealthy landowner in Ruth chapter 2 verse 1. The first words out of his mouth are seeking a blessing from the God of Israel in chapter 2 verse 4. And it seems his workers respect him, they share his beliefs. He's really, the people of the city support him. He's concerned about the safety and well-being of Ruth. He specifically tells his workers, don't harass her. So he makes provision to keep this widow and foreigner safe. And he goes well above and beyond what the law requires, right? Well above and beyond the rules around gleaning your field and the like. So he's not insisting on his own rights. He goes beyond his obligation to provide. He's an example of, I think, how God expects us to operate in his economy when we have wealth, when we have sufficient means. And also perhaps 1 Corinthians 6 verse 7, suffer yourselves to be defrauded. Boaz wasn't worried if Ruth perhaps pushed the boundaries a little bit in her gleaning. He was happy to let that go. He provided practical care at his own expense for the unfortunate and for the immigrants. I suspect that Boaz wouldn't be a popular character in the right-wing evangelical MAGA movement at the moment, because he certainly didn't insist on his own rights and the rights of the locals at the expense of others. There is a strange piece about Boaz that I find. He's passive, right? We think, like in chapter 4, he runs to the city gate, gets up early and go, gets it done. But that's at the prompting of Ruth and Naomi, right? And sometimes people will, and it's understandable, talk about a comparison between Boaz and Jesus because both are redeemers. And so there's sort of this obvious link of, look, he's redeeming this Gentile widow, takes her as his bride, and we could sit and just bing, 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 see types and connections going off there. But in the record itself, Boaz doesn't really take the initiative. And one of the issues that Naomi has is Ruth has been out there gleaning in his field through the barley harvest, through the wheat harvest, which is a period of at least 2 months. And Boaz has generously provided, but he hasn't done anything else. And so it's Naomi who actually kicks him along by sending Ruth to give a message. So again, it's sort of this women are driving the plot forward. Boaz takes what is actually Ruth's proposition and solution to the city gate as to what the legal solution should be. So, Jesus obviously is active in his role and desire to be a redeemer. Boaz seems to have been a little bit more sitting back. And maybe that's because he was older, which Ruth chapter 3 verse 10 says, or certainly intimates, you could have gone after one of the younger men, indicates he was probably older. In Jewish culture, it would have been unusual if Boaz wasn't married, given that he was older and he was a respected person. He probably was already married, maybe a widower. But it's very unlikely that he was just an eligible older bachelor who never found the right girl until the Moabite turned up. Just one more thing about Boaz in the man's history. Who was his mum and dad? Pop quiz. No idea? No, that's not quite the right answer. No, Idumean? No, not that one either. Salmon? Yep, and? His mum? Rahab. Which I just think is interesting. We're going to talk about providence a little bit later, right? But when this Moabite widow turns up, needing a shelter, maybe God's plan to actually put this together already had started a generation earlier. who would be better positioned, like culturally conditioned by his family, to take in a Moabite, except someone who actually was born of a Canaanite? Yeah. Anyway. Ruth's life was tough, in some ways which are obvious, and some ways which are not so obvious. One of the things which I didn't quite realise, it says explicitly in Ruth chapter 1, verse 4, the boys were married, and then after 10 years, the boys die. You're like, okay, cool. I mean, not cool, terrible. The obvious point that you didn't understand there, Daniel, the first time through, is there were no children. They've been married for 10 years and no children. You would expect there would be children. It's probably a call back to Genesis 16, verse 3, where Abraham and Sarah are in the land for 10 years, no children. She gives up, and then Hagar is brought into the equation, right? So, whilst it's not explicitly mentioned, Ruth and Orpah both would have borne the stigma of being barren, because obviously in their society it was always the woman's fault. An additional burden that Ruth would have carried. Very patriarchal society. Death of her husband, no male left in the family, and now she's tied to this older woman, Naomi, who is clearly, as she expresses it in Ruth chapter 1, too old to have children. And then when they get back to Bethlehem, again, things you're not told in the record, but it's clear that Ruth is sent off to glean, not Naomi. Does that mean Naomi was too old and infirm to do it? I don't know, but she doesn't appear to have been out there getting food for them at all. So Ruth is sort of tied to Naomi, having to help her, and of course Naomi ends up being very, very, very bitter. So that would have been extra difficult as well. It's not like you've got this appreciative person that you're supporting. Somewhat painfully, I suspect, when Ruth and Naomi get back to Bethlehem, Naomi says, I went out full and I've come back empty. I'm all alone. There's nothing. I've got nothing left. And Ruth's standing right alongside her, or maybe, a foot behind her. And Naomi's just denied her very existence, right? And said, I'm bitter because God's against me. So Ruth had it pretty tough in all of that. What did Ruth look like? Well, if we go and inspect all the portraits and everything that were taken at the time, they show that Ruth was young, beautiful, genetically fabulous, like Boaz, and very Caucasian, which is somewhat surprising, quite surprising. And both of them had very soppy, loving, sort of soppy eyes for each other. That's the other thing that's clear from art history. It's extremely unlikely, isn't it? Extremely unlikely. There's no mention actually of them loving each other. That doesn't actually enter into the record, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, and I'll get in trouble from Sarah, but we'll do it anyway. Ruth's personality. What do we know about Ruth's personality? Well, we know that she's a very hard worker, she's very diligent, and her number one characteristic is that she shows faithful love. That is the defining feature of Ruth. She embodies Hesed, that loving faithfulness. Right, and as I said, the whole book is a story of Hesed, loving faithfulness. It is not about, it's not romance, sadly. Now, that chart just shows the relative occurrence of the word Hesed in that one. Shows the relative occurrences of the word Hesed relative to word count, so sort of the frequency. And you can see Ruth there in the light blue bar. Guess which book is the yellow bar there, where the word Hesed occurs a gazillion times relative to other words? Psalms. The clue was in the reading. Well done. And it's pretty much on the basis of that chapter that it occurs so frequently. And then, of course, in some of the prophets. But whilst in Ruth it only actually occurs 3 times in the 1,252 times, 52 words, it occurs in Ruth chapter 1, verse 8, where Naomi acknowledges the loving faithfulness, the loving kindness that the 2 women had demonstrated to their husbands and to her. And again in chapter 3, verse 10, where Boaz says, you show incredible loving kindness and faithfulness, and it's used once of God in Ruth 2, verse 20. But the occurrences actually understate the importance of this idea in the book. Because as Boaz says in Ruth chapter 3, verse 10, Ruth is famous for her display of continual loving kindness. It was her core feature and characteristic. The point of his comment is this Moabite woman was an embodiment of hesed, of loving kindness. And there's no suggestion of love, affection, romance per se from Boaz to Ruth or vice versa. Their relationship is defined as one of hesed, faithful love to others. When Ruth proposes, Boaz commends her devotion to Naomi, which is not kind of what you would normally do. I suspect, those of you who are married, when you proposed, there wasn't an immediate response of, yes, and you really do love your grandma. That's not a very normal sort of response, certainly not a romantic one, to note your fiance's love to somebody else. And in Ruth chapter 4, verse 9, concluding the whole court scene, Boaz speaks first of Naomi and then of Ruth, talking about continuing the family line. There's no hint of romance, and the women of the village don't celebrate the love of Boaz and Ruth together, like what a wonderful occasion, this happy couple. What they celebrate is the reversal of Naomi's fortunes, that everything has now turned around for Naomi. And her love and her loyalty to Naomi, not to Boaz. So what is a little bit more of perhaps what hesed means? Means kindness, loving kindness, mercy, goodness, faithfulness. It usually occurs between people. It's frequently reciprocal, but it's something specifically that goes beyond duty. It is a sacrificial kind of loving kindness. It's a covenantal love that goes beyond perhaps just the simple words that we have in English to explain it. And a key thing is that hesed, is contagious and transformative, and that's seen in the book. Most obviously, it's the faithfulness of Ruth that transforms the future of Naomi. But more than that, Naomi moves from being bitter and kind of passive, convinced in Ruth 1 that God is against her, to suddenly at the end of Ruth chapter 2 and Ruth 3, being alive, being faithful and perceiving the blessings of God. So seeing that faithful love in somebody else transformed Naomi. It's a transformative characteristic. And we saw in the reading tonight Psalm 136, it is a key part of how God operates, that faithful, enduring love. And it underpins everything that God does, has done and will do for Israel and for all of us. That psalm moved from creation, Exodus, the wilderness wanderings, right through to his ongoing care for Israel. Every aspect of God's actions can be seen through that lens. And it's a core quality of what God wants to see in us. Essentially, you can take this idea of hesed and map it straight to what we would traditionally call agape love in the New Testament. That sacrificial love that is putting God and putting other people ahead of yourself. And Ruth demonstrates what that looks like in daily life, and not in a good daily life, in a challenging daily life. And that's the remarkable thing about Ruth. Well, that is darker up there than I thought it was going to be. One character that appears to be missing from the book of Ruth is actually God. God's not actually acknowledged as doing anything. Now, if I put you on the spot again and said, Old Testament books, name some Old Testament books where God doesn't actually do anything. Like there's no revelation, there's no prophet, there's no dreams, there's no specific acts of God, miracles. Esther, there's one, absolutely. There's not debatably, there's two others, kind of. So the wisdom literature, Song of Solomon, Proverbs, right? But they really are a different sort of genre. But, Esther and Ruth. Which is interesting because if you put, again, Ruth in that historical context, you've gone Genesis through the wilderness wanderings, right? And then you go through Samuel, Kings and Chronicles, and of course there's the prophets operating. So there's a tremendous amount in all of those records of God directly intervening and being active in the affairs of the nation, people, saving people, doing all these things. But you've got the book of Ruth, which is, early in this whole piece. God's not specifically active in there. There's a there's of people. Naomi hears that God has brought a good harvest in Bethlehem in Ruth chapter 1, and there's a view that God brings children, right? But nothing actually says God sent the rains or God gave her a child, right? Now, in some ways, that makes the book a lot more relatable, because we can't actually see God active in our lives. We don't directly see miracles, have direct revelation, have spirit-driven prophets. We don't have those things in our lives, which is so much of the Old Testament, right? All of it basically does. But then you've got Ruth and Esther, where God is not a direct, visible actor in the same way. And that's much more the world that we live in. Romans 8 verse 28, all things work together for good for those who love God, but exactly where and how can sometimes be a matter of conjecture, of perception, but not direct confirmation. God's hand's not always visible to us, even if we might think he did this or he did that. Ruth and Naomi never get confirmation that God was working for them. They happened to go into Boaz's field, this happened, that happened, and they perhaps perceived that as being God's hand, but there was no specific divine feedback. They just had to live their lives in faithfulness just as we do, trusting that God is working, but we may not ever see that, certainly not in the short term. However, despite God never actually definitively doing anything, it seems he is always there. If you like, God's everywhere absent, but everywhere present. He's never explicitly active, but I think providence clearly is driving the record forward towards David at a national level, but also turning Naomi's tragedy around at a personal level. But it happens in very mundane ways. Naomi hears a rumour. Ruth happens to glean. Boaz has to be kind of made aware of his thing and think about it and find a way forward. And as I said before, perhaps even Boaz's parents had preconditioned him to be more receptive to this Moabite widow than the average man. All fairly mundane, unexciting things. But because of the faith of Ruth, God works with those things and suddenly moves his purpose forward to bring David onto the national stage. God's involved in the very ordinary small things of our lives. That's, I think, for me, one of the takeouts of Ruth. Even if we can't see it, it demonstrates that God works through, not despite, the everyday faithfulness of his people. But it's in small things, not necessarily in the big, flashy events. And I don't claim to understand providence. God can act any way he pleases, but history clearly demonstrates that the big interventions are surprisingly rare exceptions, even in the biblical period. It seems that God is far more focused, to me, on his plans for the kingdom than necessarily ensuring that our lives are free of bumps and lumps on the way through. And while sometimes there may be happy endings, as there kind of was for Naomi, that's not always the case. Even in the book of Ruth, Naomi's life has turned around, she's got this new child, but I don't think we could ever pretend that that would fill the hole left by her husband and her first two sons. she's a mother who's lost 2 children. So even though clearly things are turned around, nothing's quite going to fill the hole in her heart, despite the love of Ruth and a new baby. And the narrator draws us, I think, to the bigger conclusion, the bigger picture, that God's providence was working through the faithfulness of Ruth to bring a bigger and a better blessing, the Davidic kings that would come into the nation. So God's not solving the problems of life, but he's working in our lives to save our lives. And I think that's the point of all of his work. So the book of Ruth, I think it's more than an ancient narrative. It's really a testament to how God's providence works and the importance of faithfulness that enables God to work in our lives. And Ruth's faithfulness ultimately led to transformation in Naomi's life and bringing forward of the kingdom agenda. Ruth's story, I think, demonstrates that no act of faithfulness is wasted. Even when we can't see it, God is working to bring forward the kingdom, to redeem us, to bring ultimate joy, even if there is, pain along the way. So yes, I think our daily choices to act in kindness, in loving faithfulness, can transform the world around us. And that's what I think I take out of the book of Ruth. Nothing is in vain because God is always at work, no matter how humble the circumstance. Thanks.